Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. Today with me is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Good. You know, looking at the news coming from the mainstream media and trying to keep up to date on what they're talking about, looks like the big issue is that Trump's getting some new personnel for his campaign. I mean, that was all over the TV. But guess what? I don't want to talk about that.
No.
Okay. But there is some other issues that are very important and somewhat in the news, but I don't think the average person, even that's looking at the internet, I didn't find a whole lot in the internet, but to you and me, of course, this is very significant. This has to do with Yemen and what's happening over there. And I think some significant events have happened. There's been a recent violent escalation as well as a political change that has happened here in the last couple of months. And I think it's a hot spot that we've addressed before, but it looks like it's getting a little hotter now, and who knows what time will bring. But I would like to get your assessment on exactly, the political changes as well as this incident that happens routinely, but just recently there were some civilians being killed.
Yeah, and this is a 1.5-year Saudi war on Yemen. The Saudis started the war. They invaded Yemen. They've been bombing Yemen. They want to restore the former president Hadi to power. He is the one who actually had overthrown Saleh in the Arab Spring, who was a U.S. ally. Then Hadi became a U.S. ally. Now the Saudis want to put him back in. And in the middle of this, it's essentially a proxy war in a way between Saudi Arabia and Iran, with the U.S. on the side of the Saudis. And in the middle of this is the poorest country in the region, Yemen. They don't have any resources. They don't have any oil. They don't have anything, and they've suffered tremendously. I think 6,500 of them have been killed, most of them civilians. And but recently, what's gotten our attention is that the Saudis once again have started bombing within the last few days a hospital, a school, a potato chip factory. They won't even let them have potato chips. But, this is a slaughter of citizens, civilians, and it is done with, as you know, U.S. weapons. So, the U.S. has been very strong about not wanting slaughter of civilians. But guess what happens when the U.S. State Department spokesperson is asked about whether the U.S. will condemn this Saudi slaughter of civilians? And I just happen to have a handy clip that we can show their reaction when they're trying to get him to condemn it.
What, if anything, do you have to say about that?
So we're deeply concerned by a reported strike on a hospital in northern Yemen. We're gathering more information. As we've said in the past, strikes on humanitarian facilities, including hospitals, are particularly concerning. We call on all parties to cease hostilities immediately. Continued military actions only prolong the suffering of the Yemeni people.
Yeah, but this was apparently done by Saudi, the Saudi coalition that you guys are big supporters of. Is there? Have you raised this issue? This is not the first time that civilian and hospitals have been targeted there.
So we remain in close contact with the Saudis on this. We would note that the Saudi committee that was designated to look into civilian casualties, the previous ones we've discussed from this podium, did share its findings with the UN. We believe that's a step forward in transparency. And as we previously underscored, we also call on them to publicly release those reports.
But does it have any, is there any consequence to this?
Well, what I'd say is I'm not going to get ahead of any decision, but U.S. officials have regularly engaged with Saudi officials as well as other coalition members on the importance of mitigating harm.
So there you have it. They're gathering more info about it.
Well, let me tell you, Daniel, that she hasn't reassured me, and I doubt if she's reassured you that they even care. And of course, the big question is for most Americans that maybe just know a little bit about it, the Saudis are fighting with Yemen. That's a border dispute and not much else. But we're very much involved. We're involved financially. We provide the weapons. I mean, the weapons are flowing in there. It's estimated that probably in this past year, the Saudis have gotten $50 billion worth. They just had a recent vote in the Senate for over $1 billion of more weapons going there. So we're very much involved. We provide intelligence gathering for them, and it's amazing that the Houthis, the locals who they're fighting and trying to hold off on the Saudis, they're not doing badly. They haven't been pushed out to the sea. So this to me is very amazing that they can handle this. But we have a moral responsibility for this. There is no way you can justify under our constitutional that we should do this. Most people will say, well, it's not a war. Why do we have to declare a war? And the Congress is complicit. They provide all the money, and they never even ask the question. Just think of over how many votes did it take to vote these numerous times over these last several years on how much money that gets voted for this weapons industry. And it's bipartisan. Oh, it's bipartisan. It must be okay. So that is what is disgusting to me, is that we can't build a coalition against this kind of stuff. There's a few people on each side, but unfortunately, it seems like the financiers in the military-industrial complex, and that is a huge industry. The industry is over $70 billion a year of weapons. I bet the markup could be 100% or more. Billions and billions of dollars made. So it's something we should know about, the practicalities of this. The one thing that is pretty interesting is, in spite of all that, the Saudis have not had a military victory there, and it's shifting around. But then again, I understand, a lot of their allies have sort of deserted them, and I read where their only close allies that's hanging in there is al-Qaeda.
I wonder how Americans would feel if they knew that our weapons are going to the Saudis to slaughter the Yemenis, and the Saudis' only ally there is al-Qaeda. It's amazing. But, you touched on it. Why are the Houthis doing fairly well? By the way, look, the rain is coming.
Yes, very, very good. We'll survive the rain.
But why are the Houthis doing very well? And you've said this many times, they are fighting for their homeland. They are not mercenaries. The Saudis are bringing in African mercenaries. They don't have an army to speak of. But this really gives you a window on what fuels the Washington war machine, what fuels the neocon think tanks. All of this Saudi money buying all of these weapons. And I think we saw from Hillary's emails that they gave her between $10 and $20 million for their foundation. The Saudis throw money around and they buy people's silence, and that's why not many people are talking about this.
One thing I found terribly frustrating, and it's annoying because it's a mixed bag, that when we want to sell stuff overseas, I like free trade, the least regulations possible and the least licensing. Well, under Obama, and there's been over $200 billion worth of weapons sold under Obama, that under Obama, it's been made easier to sell. You think the Republicans would do this. And so they got rid of licensing. They've gotten rid of oversight. So there's probably more free trade in the distribution of weapons at great profits than anything else in the world, food or things that, aren't as nearly as important as these weapons. And yet these are the people, the very people who do this to make all this money and the political power. They're the ones who want to take the guns away from us. It is so terrible that this is why an incident like this and what's going on like this, because it's just another place. We talk about Syria, we talk about Ukraine, we talk about Iraq and Afghanistan. We don't talk a whole lot about this, but there's, I'm sure, other places that are. Recently, we opened up the doors to selling weapons to Vietnam. So it's always money involved. And the old saying about follow the money might be a pretty good idea about sorting out our foreign policy.
Yeah, and look at going back to the State Department spokesperson, look at the moral blindness of her. She says, we call on all parties to cease fire. Well, there's clearly one party that's defending its country and clearly another that's the aggressor. You know, the idea that you can't defend yourself, would that be U.S. policy if we were being attacked? Imagine if the Chinese started invading us through Mexico and Russia said we encourage all sides to stop fighting. How would we listen to that?
And they're saying that the people trying to preserve their homeland should live within the Constitution. Of course, the person they're trying to defend and put back in was elected in a corrupt election. There were no opponents. And he won. You know, believe it or not. Of course, right now he's in Saudi Arabia because he's on the run, and they're not doing well. So I think this is very, very significant. But I think when you're fighting for your homeland, there's a special thing that happens there. When you think of the tragedy of Vietnam, how the French and the Americans suffered the consequences of doing something we didn't want to do. And you don't even have to sort out. You can sort of set aside who they are and what they're fighting for, whether they're communists or socialists or what. They're fighting for their homeland, and that puts them on a moral high ground, and that would be like us fighting to keep the intruders out of our house or something like that. But this goes on, but it just digs a bigger hole for ourselves financially. This is a cost to us, and we don't gain friends by this, and there's no movement toward peace. And also, one of the articles that we looked at explain a little bit about how the UN enters into this. Did you gather from that the UN will help us in our struggle for peace, or do you think the UN could be complicit in some of this?
Well, they've been whitewashing a lot of what the Saudis have done in Yemen. They've been bribed or paid or what have you to whitewash it.
They do it, and of course they're not. They're on our government side. They're not on the side of the people here or the people over there.
Yeah, and you make a good point that Hadi did depart the country. He left the country. His term of election has expired, but the U.S. is determined with the Saudis to put him back in power. Now, contrast this with what happened in Ukraine. When Yanukovych left, they said, his term is up. He left office. He left the country. It's all over. We're going to put our guys in. So look at the hypocrisy. But the other thing I was thinking about, you want to talk about fueling radical Islam. Talk about how U.S. foreign policy fuels radical Islam. Imagine if you are an Arab and you're looking at what's happening in Yemen. You're looking at civilians being slaughtered with U.S. weapons, U.S.-provided weapons. And how are you going to feel? You're going to have a sense that you want to have revenge. So our policy is directly threatening us and making terrorist attacks on America more likely.
And it makes a mockery out of this whole notion that we're spreading American exceptionalism and that we care about civil liberties, like our statement. We'll check this out and find out what's going on. And here, Saudi Arabia, it might be one of the worst, if not the worst. I mean, they do 50 beheadings a year, and some are for they're for religious crimes. It's not even for violent crimes, and yet we continue to do it. So it's all about money. And a lot of times, I think it's, the people who chanted when we were leading up to the Iraq War, it's all about oil. It's a lot about oil, and it's a lot about oil pipelines. Maybe not in this particular case, but I'm sort of a little surprised, and you may have an opinion on this, is why is Yemen so important to the Saudis? Because, of course, the Yemens aren't a military threat to the Saudis.
Well, they've ginned up this whole idea that this is Iran's proxy army in Yemen. And that's what they've sold to the U.S. The Iranians are coming. They're going to take over. They're going to overthrow Saudi Arabia. So therefore, we have to fight them on Yemen territory, rather than there. But, there is almost a silver lining. And that's why, I think you do what you do in trying to shine the light on these things. Because I think when it comes to attention, I think we start seeing some movement and a little bit of good news, I think. Two things. One is that there are a couple of senators who are pushing back against this extra $1.1 billion in weapons, and that's Senator Murphy and Senator Rand Paul, and they're both trying to block these sales, and so we can root for them in this particular instance. The other thing is, just today, the New York Times came out with an editorial saying we should stop arms sales to Saudi Arabia until they stop slaughtering Yemeni civilians. So there is some movement. I think it's become even so grotesque that Washington has to start taking notice.
You know, ideas are important, and ideas whose time has come, they can't stop them. So maybe the ideas of a more peaceful solution and more diplomacy and less of this aggressiveness and less of this preemptive war stuff and less of the war profiteering, the better. But eventually, I think we'll win this, you know, for a mixed reason. We will have more enlightenment, you know, like you were pointing out, but we're also going to have an economic enlightenment because you can't afford this. I mean, this is an empire, and we're involved everywhere, all over the world, and it provides no security as far as I'm concerned. It incites many more enemies. It contributes to our bankruptcies, and it contributes to our economic problems that we have in this country. When we were citing some of these huge numbers that are involved in this war profiteering, you know, just think if some of that was just left in this country, you know, there'd be such a difference, and of course, I think we'd live more peacefully too. I think the main goal, and that's why we have a little organization called the Institute for Peace and Prosperity, yes, because that should be our goal. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, and we certainly wanted to make a sincere effort to call attention to you what's going on the borders and within Yemen and dealing with Saudi Arabia. And we are complicit, explicitly so, involvement with the Saudis, and they are no angels. They are one of the worst offenders on civil liberties, and here we are providing huge amounts of weaponry for them. So we are morally and politically responsible for a lot of what's going on. Saudi Arabia would not be doing what they're doing if they did not have the full support of this administration, and of course, full support, bipartisan, generally speaking, for many, many decades. And it's time we call them out on this, and for the American people to wake up and say, you know, entangling alliances and getting involved in the internal affairs of other nations and deciding to get involved in every so-called revolution is bad policy for us. The world will not come to an end if we don't get involved in all these revolutions that are going on. And believe me, I would feel much more secure and the world would be much better off. We should continue to strive for peace and prosperity. That should be our goal. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today, and I want to hope you come back soon to see us.